So without further ado, I will go ahead and get started. So we're very excited to have three panelists here. So first of all, Councilmember Droste. Lori Droste represents the Elmwood neighborhood, which is where Berkeley's exclusionary single-family zoning got its start. So she's been championing both the resolution to end exclusionary zoning and the first of several reform proposals, which would allow multifamily homes throughout the areas of the city formerly zoned only for single-family buildings. Secondly, Councilmember Terry Taplin is a newly elected council member for West Berkeley. You can only be newly elected for so long, but he's still riding on it. Terry grew up in Berkeley, has lived in Section 8 housing, experienced displacement and homelessness, and remains a tenant today. Last but not least, Mayor Jesse Arreguín, in addition to his role serving as city as a whole, also serves as the president of the Association of Bay Area Governments, or ABAG, which is responsible for determining the regional housing needs of the Bay Area. Mayor Arreguín is also a tenant and has been one of Berkeley's leading champions for tenant protections in his time on City Council. We did say that we would have a fourth panelist. Unfortunately, Karen Prolick, I'm probably mispronouncing her last name, had a conflict and wasn't able to join us, but I think everybody agreed that we've got a great panel of three. Okay, so I don't know.
I'm going to send you a text.
Alrighty. Let's just do a quick voice check, I guess. Councilmember Droste, I'll just call you Lori. Can you speak up? Can everybody hear you?
Hi, everyone.
There we go. Alrighty. Councilmember Taplin, Terry.
Hello, everyone. Good evening.
Alrighty. And Mayor Arreguín, Jesse.
Good evening.
Fantastic. And Jesse didn't pop up on video. There we go. I can see the video now. Fantastic. All right, so I will go ahead and get started. So I'm going to ask a question to all the panelists, and I'll just sort of go through one by one just for the answers. But overall, last week, Berkeley City Council adopted a resolution calling for an end to exclusionary zoning. What does this mean to you personally? And what's your problem with their existing zoning laws? Maybe I'll start with Mayor Arreguín, if that's okay, or Jesse, do you want to answer first?
Certainly. Well, I'm proud of the city of Berkeley that we're the first at many things, but one area that I'm not proud of is that we are one of the first cities to adopt zoning regulations that were initially created to try to prevent African Americans and other people of color and things like a dance hall from actually being established in the Elmwood district. And if you look at the historical record, this is very clear. And so our single family zoning laws were built on a foundation of racial exclusion. And that's the foundation in which Berkeley's built environment, as well as our housing market, is built on. In addition, redlining, which put in place restrictive covenants and limited where African Americans and Asian Americans can live in Berkeley, also further exacerbated this racial segregation. And so there are parts of our city that are closed off to tenants and to working families and people of color through zoning regulations. But if you actually look at the city of Berkeley, in many of our flatlands neighborhoods, there's a mix of different types of building typologies. You have, including on my block, you have single family homes, you have large apartment buildings, you have fourplexes. So this is not a new radical thing. This is something that's consistent with Berkeley's built environment. But the intent is to recognize that systemic racism exists not just in policing and law enforcement, but in every aspect of our society, including in our housing policies, and that single-family zoning was established with a racially exclusive intent, and has perpetuated racial and economic segregation in our cities. So if we are going to move forward as a community and really be a progressive city, and a city that believes in equity and inclusion, then we have to address this issue of restrictive housing policies. So I was very pleased to join a unanimous Berkeley City Council. Let me say it was a unanimous vote. It wasn't just the proponents. I think that indicates our intent to proceed in this conversation on zoning reform in an inclusive way, and in a way that addresses the historic inequities that have existed in our housing policies, to engage the whole community, including those impacted in this conversation, and to also address the issues of affordability and public safety.
Great, thank you, Jesse. Terry, that was a pretty complete answer from Jesse, but is there anything you want to add to that?
Sure. I'll add that last month, Mayor Arreguín and I, as well as Councilmember Ben Bartlett, raised the Black Lives Matter flag in Civic Center Park. And it's really important that we follow up these very important and moving gestures with policy redressals to our legacy of racial exclusion. In addition to the origins of exclusionary zoning, our current problem rests in our inability to build affordable housing, missing middle housing in the majority of Berkeley's neighborhoods. My neighborhood has a mix of apartments and triplexes and duplexes and single family homes. But when my district was downzoned, both around St. Pablo Park, as well as my neighborhood in West Berkeley, this is when we start to see the Black population decline sharply. St. Pablo Park is no longer a majority African-American homeowner neighborhood. So not only did exclusionary zoning fail to prevent gentrification or displacement, it also impedes our city's ability to redress those by constructing new affordable housing.
Right. All right. What about Lori? What are your thoughts on this basic question?
Well, hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Some of you may or may not know, I was a former high school history teacher. So I've been reading up on Berkeley's history a lot over the past few years and been having really interesting conversations with people like Dorothy Walker, who helped desegregate our public schools. And she was the first, I think she was the first head of the American Planning Association. And, you know, as I've walked around my neighborhood, what I thought was really interesting is we have these beautiful examples of fourplexes. There's one behind me here that's in our neighborhood, and Jesse has one as well, of that were able to exist before they were banned, and they exist in all areas. And what was interesting to me is I could walk down one street where I would see fourplexes that are currently not allowed, for instance, that are just the size of essentially a large family home. And then I could walk down a parallel street and they were allowed. So I found this really interesting. I also was talking with a lot of researchers at UC, particularly in the Othering and Belonging Institute, and they just did a really big study on racial and income inequities and how policymakers can help address this. And so, you know, what I was really interested in putting forward a resolution saying that this is something that we want to recognize and acknowledge, but also take very careful, measured steps to figure out how we can undo these exclusionary patterns. You know, not something that will happen overnight, but that will be a really engaged community process. And that's something, and that's why we've sort of begun this process early. You know, I've talked over the past week to elected officials in throughout the Bay Area and how they're going to be pursuing this as well. The difference is that we're letting people know that this is happening, where they're maybe waiting a few months to allow for a long community process. So it's a holistic, engaged process, so we can hear from the community about what might be appropriate for our neighborhoods. So, you know, I was really excited that we began this conversation. And I think the historical arc is pretty interesting, but I just want to be very clear that we passed unanimously this resolution, sort of identifying this historic problem that's embedded itself into our land use patterns. But then it's a separate conversation now that we're talking about zoning revision guidelines. And that's going to be a long and collaborative process with our community, hopefully, if council chooses to move ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just speaking personally, I've seen a lot of comments on Nextdoor and things like that. They don't seem to understand the the duration of the process in Berkeley that we'll be going through. So I think that's important. Lori, I'm going to keep following up with you. You know, now that we've decided to tackle exclusionary zoning, we're hearing a lot of talk about missing middle. We mentioned in this. Can you talk about what missing middle is and what does it have to do with affordability? Yep. There you go. We seem to be.
Okay, there we go.
There we go.
Sorry. Thank you very much. So missing middle housing is a range of clustered or multi-unit housing that's often similar in size, scale, and design to single-family homes. And they're also housing types that are naturally affordable and less expensive housing options than single-family homes. So again, you know, this is not about large apartment buildings or, you know, sort of the larger developments that we hear a lot about, but just very gentle density, as incremental of an approach as we can possibly pursue. That's precisely why we tried to take this very incremental approach recommended by the League of California Cities, because we wanted to have we wanted to pursue zoning revisions that would be compatible in neighborhood scale. So it's very subtle, and it's also more naturally affordable to individuals, because right now we're hearing from a lot of people, teachers can't afford to live here, our firefighters can't afford to live here. We have a lot of people that want to be able to have their children move back in with them. And so that's really our angle in approaching this.
Can you unpack a little bit more? Kind of, you say naturally affordable, like what is it that makes it affordable, or how, to what degree does it make it affordable?
So, you know, this is not to get too technical, because I know that some people here are really well versed in this, but when we talk about affordable housing, generally speaking, when we're talking about land use, we're talking about subsidized, deed restricted, permanently affordable units that people have to apply for in a lottery system, right? Missing middle housing is not that type of subsidized housing, but what it does allow for, and if you look at the census data, newly built missing middle housing, or even, you know, if somebody wants to convert a portion of their home, is more often available to those of moderate incomes compared to those who are able to access single family homes. So it's a cheaper option. I know many times when my friends are looking for a place to live, sometimes they are looking for a duplex or a triplex because it's what they can afford, because they can't afford a single family home. So when we say naturally affordable, we're saying that it's not subsidized, deed restricted. But I want to add that we are recommending that we pursue however many options that we can to ensure affordability, right? So we're drawing a very big tent, and we're open to suggestions from the professionals, hopefully, that we would be able to consult with if this passes council.
All right, thank you, Lori. Terry, question for you. What's the link between zoning and racial justice, and how do you think that this will, how do you think this will impact the community you represent at District 2?
Thank you. I think, you know, the strongest link between zoning and racial justice is the legacy of exclusionary zoning as a tool for racial exclusion. Just knowing that, you know, neighborhoods were engineered and zoned to keep out people like me. Not only is it deeply hurtful, it also imposes upon me and my colleagues a moral imperative to undo that, to make our city more inclusive. The impact that it has now, I mean, fortunately, we've moved on from a lot of the, you know, out loud racial hostilities of some of our predecessors here in Berkeley. But we still see neighborhoods that are exclusive to low-income households, tenants, people of color. And so in being able to bring back fourplexes, bring back apartments, we'll be able to bring more people who are who are like me. I was born in, one of these hideous, unspeakable, ugly apartments. And then I, I grew up in a Section 8 household, that wouldn't be in my neighborhood if some of those forces had prevailed. So I think yeah, so that's like the biggest thing. As far as what zoning reform can do for my district, I think one of the big things that's most valuable to Black households is to have land to be close to family. So if homeowners are able to subdivide their homes or add onto their existing homes, it facilitates a kind of intergenerational living that actually has made Berkeley home for my family until everyone left because they couldn't expand. There are a lot of folks who are doing what I'm doing, which is caring for an elder, my parent. There are elders who want to see their grandchildren and they want their kids to come back. And everyone who I grew up with who's still in Berkeley, this is how we're living. So by legalizing intergenerational living, we'll actually be able to accommodate a more diverse array of families in Berkeley.
Thank you, Terry. Lori, I mean, obviously there's a lot of diversity in every district, right? And both in terms of the area it covers, but still D8 that you represent as a fairly privileged area in aggregate. What does equity between districts mean for you in this discussion?
Well, by banning less expensive housing options, the current zoning map dictates that predominantly wealthier families will be able to live or rent in certain parts of Berkeley. But at the same time, we've also heard from people, I know I've heard from people in my district who might want to duplex their house or triplex their house and allow their grandkids to move in or to age in place. Or maybe even an individual wants to extra income by dividing up their house and able to rent it out. So, and the truth is that, as I mentioned before, these buildings are all over currently the district. It's just now on some streets they're banned and in others they're not. And in fact, I've heard from some constituents who, they don't know they live on a street where they said, well, I don't want you to mess with the zoning regulations because I love my street, and that street is fine because it has missing middle, and all of our streets are fine. This isn't an indictment of single family homes or people who live in single family homes. I'm in my single family home, but more a conversation around allowing for flexibility to have compatible and scale homes for people. Because honestly, what I hear from over and over from people are sort of a series of topics, and that is housing affordability, climate change, homelessness, and traffic, honestly. And this zoning reform can touch on all pieces of that in a positive way, right? We're seeing so many people having to commute long distances because they can't afford to live in our city. So we've seen speeding traffic through our neighborhoods. We see the crisis every day in our streets around homelessness. And all of that, it really is related. So if we are talking about permanent solutions, even to homelessness, we have to also talk about that affordable housing is banned in a large part of our city, right? So I think it's worth having a conversation, and in a community process, a very holistic community process. So and I'll just add that Oakland just announced today that they're also going to be looking into this, and I think it makes sense to start this conversation, not only for equity concerns and some of these concerns that people have raised, but it's also a real opportunity for homeowners who might want to be able to adapt their property in ways that they're currently prohibited from doing so now.
All right, thank you. Jesse, we hear a lot of concerns about fire risk. You know, I live in a fire-prone area myself. How do we advance this kind of policy to address equity and integration while still ensuring safety in the fire-prone areas? What would that look like?
Well, thank you for asking that question. You know, I think the issue of public safety, as we're discussing and developing these regulations, is extremely important. You know, in the resolution we adopted last week, we discussed about prioritizing public safety as part of the criteria that we use in developing and evaluating new regulations. And we do know that parts of our city, Panoramic Hill, for example, or even parts of the Berkeley Hills, have very narrow streets that it is very difficult for vehicles, let alone emergency vehicles, to get through. And we also know that 1991, there was the East Bay firestorm. And we also know that our hills are facing extreme fire risk along the wildland urban interface. I mean, the fires that we've seen in Northern California and over the past year, I think raise a real serious concern about the safety of our community and how we're prepared to address fire risk. So I do think it's important that while we're looking at expanding density and expanding housing in single-family residential neighborhoods that don't currently allow it, that we also look at the width of streets and whether the width of streets or there's proper egress, because we don't want to put people in an area where emergency vehicles, let alone people, can't evacuate in the event of a fire. So we have to look at those issues. And similarly, we have not only prioritized fire safety over the past few years, we're putting in over $1 million in funding for vegetation management, the Safe Passages program. We passed Measure FF this past November, which will provide significantly more resources for our wildfire response and mitigation. But also in most recently adopting regulations to establish parking minimums and maximums. We did use the width of streets and sort of fire safety as a lens in terms of looking at where we establish those regulations. So I do think this is something we can do. I don't think it's going to exempt a whole lot of Berkeley, but I do think we need to balance public safety with opening up opportunities for housing in our residential neighborhoods. And that's our commitment. You know, I just want to clarify, we do take very seriously the concerns around fire risk. This is a very important issue. Our responsibility as elected officials is to protect the health and safety of our community. That does not mean that we cannot also have a conversation on zoning reform.
Jesse, I guess just as a follow-up on that, I mean, not to descend into Berkeley's process, but just for the residents who are concerned, I mean, what will be their avenue for adding input and sort of really understanding kind of this risk factor?
So assuming the city council votes to move forward this item, which I am a co-sponsor of, it will start a 2-year public process, and any amendment to the city's general plan requires public hearings, and it's going to require consultation with our fire department. The resolution that we adopted last week made very clear that we are committed to a robust community engagement process that will involve all neighborhoods affected. And so we've already received lots of comments from neighbors who live in the Hills District Overlay who are concerned around the issues of fire risk. They need to be heard. They need to be consulted. Their council member needs to be part of the conversation. The fire department, I think, needs to play a very critical role in this conversation also. And really doing an analysis of which streets do pose the greatest risk so that we have that information to consider when we're looking at where to put in place new zoning regulations. So you have our commitment that this is not the end of the process. This is the beginning of what will be a long and inclusive community process, consulting those neighbors and neighborhoods that are going to be most directly impacted by the changes that are being discussed.
Okay, thank you, Jesse. Terry, switching to you, kind of a similar note, we hear a lot of concerns about how this might affect tenants. Can you speak both to what protections do tenants have today around this sort of thing, as well as is there anything else you think needs to be done when we're considering these policies around tenants?
Sure. Berkeley has some of the strongest tenant protections in the whole state. We have a rent board, you know, but it's also really important that any changes to zoning not displace existing tenants. And so some of the things that we should consider include a right to return, that no new development should displace any current rent-controlled affordable or Section 8 units, and that we include as part of our recommendations a displacement risk analysis. In addition to these things, we should also think about, are there tenants who are currently living in buildings that are barely habitable? There is a kind of displacement through lack of upkeep that kind of takes place under the radar. But it's really important that we think about all these things holistically, and we really foreground existing tenants. New housing should not displace the neighbors that we are currently living with. And if there is a need to relocate, there should be robust assistance, and those folks should be able to come back as well.
Jesse, if you don't mind me asking you as a follow-up, I mean, I know that certain protections were already created as part of state law, this SB 330. I don't know if you could explain a little bit more sort of from your perspective as the mayor and the renter, what do you know is already existing in terms of protections?
Absolutely. Well, one thing I forgot to mention with respect to the last question, and I think this is an important fact to get into the record. The general plan has a robust public safety element that looks at issues around wildfire risk, earthquake risk, and any zoning changes that we're contemplating will require environmental review, which also will require that public safety analysis that we talked about. But regardless, we're still committed to looking at this very serious issue and really balancing it as part of our development of zoning regulations. I actually live in a property that would be a prime candidate for a fourplex. It's a one-story duplex, either building a fourplex or four particular units on a lot. And while we do need to build more housing, I'm also on a personal level concerned if we don't have strong tenant protections around the potential displacement of tenants like myself. We know housing is already expensive in Berkeley, and so finding new housing will be even more difficult. So we have strong tenant protections already in place statewide in the city of Berkeley. Senate Bill 330, which will apply to most projects that would be put forward under these new regulations, requires that if you demolish any rent-controlled housing, that you have to replace that housing. And our local demolition ordinance, which we are actually also in the process of updating, also requires mitigating the loss of rent-controlled housing through payment of a fee to our housing trust fund, or to replace those demolished units with new permanently affordable units, as well as robust protections for tenants such as relocation assistance and the right to reoccupy the housing once the new project is built. And there are also rules around you can't demolish if you've done an Alice Act eviction, which is a state law that allows landlords to evict all the tenants in the property if they go out of the rental housing business, or other forms of evictions. There are restrictions on demolitions. So we have very strong protections in place already, but we're committed to taking a closer look and making sure that we have very robust protections, noticing requirements, that we're looking at issues around discouraging speculation. All those things are things that we're committed to explore.
Great. Thank you, Jesse. Lori, turning back to you. So a huge portion of our greenhouse gas emissions is driven by driving automobiles, and we know we need to shift more to walking, biking, and transit usage. How does missing middle relate to climate change?
Thank you for that question. But just one other thing I was going to add, and I'm glad that Jesse mentioned, what the process involved with general plan amendments and environmental analysis is always being part of the process. But I do also want to add, displacement is something that is a big concern of ours, and We have been consulting with some of the nation's leading experts in displacement, including Karen Chappell from the Urban Displacement Project, who strongly supports this policy. We've also seen studies out of Portland with the zoning revisions that they've put forward, and their displacement risk analysis. And you pursue incremental reforms like this, that you are likely to reduce the displacement risk anywhere from 21 to 28% of low-income renters. So I just wanted to add that. And then moving on to climate, that's one thing that, you know, I think sometimes as electeds, we're just sort of used to talking about this stuff. But when I talk to my friends, they're like, what does this have at all to do with climate? and it's a good question. So in 2018, climate researchers at Cal quantified local and state opportunities to reduce greenhouse gases from, you know, a comprehensive consumption-based perspective. And the most impactful local policy to potentially reduce greenhouse gas consumption is to create more homes for individuals. And again, this gets back to people having to commute very long distance place that they can afford. And, you know, so in short, we can meaningfully address climate change if we allow for people to live in the communities where they work. You know, as I mentioned before, you know, we hear concerns around traffic, and that's why we have pedestrian advocates backing our plan, because they know that this actually will reduce the speeding cars through our city. We have bicycling advocates supporting this. The Sierra Club even weighed in support of our resolution to end exclusionary zoning. And we have the Greenbelt Alliance as well support. So we have a broad cross section of people who are really interested in climate and ways to solve our climate crisis. And this is one very meaningful step that we can take. Again, I honestly think that this is so incremental. We're actually not going to see an enormous shift. I think more it's sort of we're beginning a conversation that is a interesting conversation, but I think it's important nonetheless to talk about the links between land use and climate change.
Thank you, Lori. Jesse, I'm going to ask you another couple of kind of process questions. So RHNA is a word that many of us have learned in the last 5 years. Can you explain, especially with your hat from ABAG, what is it? What does it mean? What should Berkeley expect, and how will this play out?
So RHNA, I also like to define acronyms as the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. And since the 1970s, regional governments have had to allocate housing units, housing need to cities and counties in California. And so in the Bay Area, the Association of Bay Area Governments, ABAG, is our regional council of governments. I am the president of the Association of Bay Area Governments. I was elected by mayors and supervisors and officials from throughout the whole 9-county Bay Area region. And so for the past 2 years, we've been working hard to develop a formula for how to distribute those units to cities like Berkeley, counties throughout the Bay Area. We had a committee of roughly 20 stakeholders, local government officials, environmental leaders, business leaders, people with housing expertise, equity advocates, that met over a whole year period to develop a formula and to center equity in our approach to the RHNA. So this year, we have had to comply with several new state laws that have impacted how the RHNA is implemented in the state of California. SB 828, which was authored by Senator Wiener in 2017, resulted in very significant changes to local planning law. And as a result, regional governments throughout the state of California have to plan for significantly more housing than they have had to historically. So in the San Francisco Bay Area, we have to plan for over 400,000 units over an 8-year period. And so we have been working hard to develop a formula that addresses a variety of factors to affirmatively further fair housing, to make sure that we are distributing particularly affordable housing equitably throughout the region. To address the jobs housing imbalance. We know that there are communities in the Bay Area that have created thousands of jobs, but have not built sufficient housing for their employees. And that's created a regional housing crisis that we're experiencing here in the East Bay. So looking at jobs housing imbalance, looking at reducing greenhouse gas emissions and locating housing close to transit. And so the RHNA methodology that we have approved, and which is under review by the state of California, is requiring that most local governments will have to significantly plan for more housing than what they have in the past. In Berkeley, our RHNA allocation that we have to plan for this next 8-year cycle is 9,000 units. That's about a 200% increase over what we had to plan for last cycle. That's the same in Palo Alto. That's the same in Cupertino. That's San Francisco seeing a massive increase. So, you know, we've gotten a lot of questions from residents about the RHNA and why didn't we appeal? Well, every community in the Bay Area has to plan for more housing. That's the reality. And so this proposal, the Quadplex proposal, I think is important to have one tool for many tools for us to use to meet that 9,000 unit target and to accommodate more housing in the region. The effects of us not planning for that housing is we would not have a compliant housing element. We would actually be ineligible for certain state housing funding. And then if we don't meet our RHNA targets, another state law, SB 35, Senate Bill 35, would kick in, and that would result in by right approval of certain housing projects if we don't meet certain benchmarks. So historically, the RHNA has not had much teeth, but with SB 35 and SB 828, it has really changed the game. And so I do believe this proposal is an important tool for us to look at expanding housing throughout Berkeley. We're not going to be able to build all of it on our corridors, but we want to do this in a thoughtful way that's respectful of neighborhoods. And so that's the RHNA. We get it. We every 8 years, our ABAG and councils of governments have to distribute housing units throughout the region. We have to plan for 9,000 units. That's a 200% increase over what we've had to do before. And so now that we have this number, what we have to do is update our housing element of our general plan and identify sites in Berkeley that can accommodate those units. And that will mean that we have to adjust zoning in certain parts of Berkeley.
If I could just
Sorry, that was a long answer, but it's a very esoteric and bureaucratic thing, so I want to explain it.
That was good. If I could just add something too, one question that we've received is why, why aren't you focusing on transit corridors? And let me assure you, this is not an either or issue. This is something that we're going to be looking at for the entire city, right? So it's not as if we're not looking at transit corridors. We have to, in order to zone for the capacity that is required of us by law. So it's not an either or, but sort of a holistic conversation that we need to have and we're required to have.
Well, and I'm going to put a quick question to any of y'all that want to address it, is that when you really look at what it takes to build a fourplex, even if we upzone for fourplex all throughout the city, there's only going to be limited sites that people will really want to build in any given neighborhood, any given street, or that will be feasible. Is that a fair assumption on my part, that it won't see entire streets happening to it?
No, yeah, I mean, there's a reason why it's called missing middle, because it's missing. So there is a lot that we don't know, but it doesn't mean that we're not going to require people to to say you no longer can live in your single family home. You have to be able to have a zone capacity of 2, 3, 4, and so this is I'm convinced that this is an incremental change. As I mentioned, the League of California Cities which has been a vocal critic of some of this state housing legislation, has even supported this. So again, this is a very, very minor step. I've also heard that the margins, frankly, aren't that great. So it's not as if, and again, we want to be open to having this conversation and having safeguards in place. But we have heard from many people very knowledgeable in this field that you're just not going to, the margins aren't great enough to see people come in and snatch up properties just to create a triplex or something. I think it's going to be much more incremental. And frankly, I think that we won't notice that much in our built environment, because what's very important to us is the scale issue. And that's why we've moved the conversation away from I certainly want to talk about fourplexes and triplexes, because I think that's really important. But people are getting caught up in unit count, when really we just want to say, we want to look at this gentle density, right? This neighborhood scale. What are the forms? What might be appropriate heights? What might be appropriate depths and widths? But that is all so technical that we need professionals to help us. And so that's what we're saying, let's explore these possibilities. Maybe it's possible in some areas, maybe it's not, but let's engage with professionals and begin to have this conversation. So it's really the beginning of a conversation. And again, I just really want to emphasize that all cities will be having this conversation, and we just want to make sure that we have extra time for this community process. I talked to a planner that said, wow, you're really having this conversation way in advance, because we know that we're going to be talking about this a lot at the end of the year. But I really reiterated to him that we know Berkeley, we know that people want to get involved. And so that's why we're putting this on the table now to start this conversation about how we can holistically adapt to our future.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, I am going to at this point shift to some of the audience questions. And let me just say that we've got dozens. So I appreciate everything and trying to surf it to see sort of, what are topics we really haven't touched on. Jesse, we sort of touched on this one, but with respect to RENA, what is being done to increase housing near BART stations in La Marinda, Dublin, Pleasanton, and other cities over the hill? It sounds like it's specific to BART, but maybe you could generalize it. Go ahead.
Well, a couple of things. One, there was a bill that passed a couple of years ago, Assembly Bill 2923, that does allow BART to develop some of their the land around their stations in Contra Costa County, Alameda County, several Bay Area counties. In Berkeley, we have been engaged the past 3 years in a planning process for studying housing at the North Berkeley and Ashby BART stations, and that process is moving forward towards the development of zoning this year. I believe that the stations in Orinda and Lafayette have not been prioritized for building housing in the next 10 years. But just like Berkeley has a plan for more housing, so do those communities. So I would argue that those stations, that public land, presents the best location to build housing, particularly its proximity to transit. So, and I would imagine that those communities are going to want to look at prioritizing building housing in their downtown area and around their BART station. So just as the RENA has started a discussion in Berkeley around where best to add additional housing, those communities will also have to have that conversation too.
Okay, thank you. Terry, I'm going to toss this one to you and I'll just read it verbatim. I'm a strong supporter of increased density in housing, but many residents are concerned that more units could have an adverse effect on the neighborhood community. For example, apartments near the UC campus that host loud parties. Can you talk about ideas or rules that could help reduce these adverse effects?
Well, to start, zoning determines what can be built. It doesn't determine how, certain buildings or housing models will be managed. I think it's important to always be a good neighbor. I went to a liberal arts college where parties were not, as chaotic as Berkeley. No offense to the mayor. But like I'm not one to control what one does in their home so long as people are not being hurt. But I always encourage responsible drinking and not littering and being respectful of one's neighbors. And so it might take some communication between the folks in the new apartments and the surrounding existing housing. But I don't see how the zoning would create rules around parties.
And if I could just add something, I just really want to emphasize what we are talking about is missing middle, right? So we're again talking about very gentle density. So when we look at close to campus in the south side, that is actually already zoned at a much higher capacity than the rest of Berkeley. And so we're not talking about large apartment buildings that surround the campus area. So I just wanted to state that as well. So I think just because I think some people have some misunderstandings about that.
Great, yeah, thank you. Okay, and I'll toss this out to any one of the panel. Please explain structures you envision will be built as a result of new zoning resolution. Will these be converted to existing houses, multiple story apartment buildings, etc.? You've kind of already just touched on that, Lori, but I don't know if you want to answer, if somebody else does. Oh, you're muted.
There, okay.
There we go.
Thank you. I'm really interested in this idea of adaptive reuse, right? And so what I'm really thinking about, and I highly recommend looking at Dan Perolik's op-ed in Berkeley side. Let me see if I can pull up the title. We can design our way out of Berkeley's housing crisis with missing middle buildings. They're a local firm here that talks a lot about missing middle and how we can design our way into beautiful architecture without the concerns around scale, right? Because what we're hearing about a lot, at least what I'm hearing about, is the scale issue. And so I think that they really address that thoughtfully. And that's something that we want to consider. And so as I mentioned that we've been moving away talking about units, even though the reason why we talked about that small incremental number is to make sure that people weren't feeling intimidated about large apartment buildings. What we're really trying to emphasize is scale. And this is a beautiful example behind me. For those of you here in District 8, this is on Russell next to the Elmwood parking lot. And that's just a beautiful example. They're beautiful examples just on the streets right near me, where it's currently not allowed. So that's my vision. I think there are great ways to help people age in place, help kids move back home. We've seen that a lot with our accessory dwelling unit laws that have been loosened over the years, that it's really provided an opportunity for people to move back to Berkeley. I can say personally, my legislative aide was unable to afford to move back to Berkeley, but she was able to move into her parents' backyard and build an ADU. So what we envision is something like that is really assisting current property owners in Berkeley. But again, we're open to a wide variety of conversations, and this is just the beginning of that conversation.
All righty. Okay, we're getting towards the end of the hour. We do want to leave a few minutes to talk about one more topic, but maybe I'll toss one to Terry before his compatriots leave. Terry, is there one question you'd like to ask one of the other panelists before they depart? Putting you on the spot here. Sorry.
I would like to ask Um, I would say, which of our corridors would they like to see first upzoned?
I'll let either of you take that question if you want.
Well, I'm happy to jump in. You know, I think San Pablo Avenue presents an incredible opportunity to, you know, to develop, you know, a regional corridor that links Contra Costa County and Alameda County. And so, as a former member of the county, Councilmember Droste took my seat on the commission. We are engaged in a multi-county planning process for looking at improving bus service and pedestrian safety on the San Pablo corridor. It's called the San Pablo Corridor Project. That includes bus priority lanes on San Pablo, including the potential for bus rapid transit, and also looking at protected bike lanes and other pedestrian improvements along the corridor. We know that some of these intersections are not protected. It's very safe as a bicyclist. I know you're kind of risking your life, like at Virginia and San Pablo trying to cross, for example. So, you know, it is a major transit corridor, a major regional corridor, and it's also an opportunity for building housing. There has been a great deal of housing built along San Pablo, but we do not have an area plan for San Pablo Avenue, even though it's a priority development area. So we hope that Berkeley will receive money from MTC to do a planning process on San Pablo. So I'd say San Pablo, but there are many other, University Avenue, Telegraph, there are lots of other places. So.
Alrighty. Okay. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you, Terry. Thank you.
I have a question for
Go ahead.
Terry Taplin. What was it like being featured in today's New York Times in only your second month of office?
It was pretty cool. Like all my St. Mary's friends and my dad are really proud of me. It was a little distracting. I was hoping to catch up on a lot of emails. But I got kind of waylaid a bit, but no, I'm really proud. I'm proud to serve with you, Lori, and with you, Jesse, and I'm proud that that cities are looking to us to light the way forward, and I'm proud for holding space for, you know, this long overdue and difficult but necessary dialogue in a way that is, you know, inclusive and transparent and compassionate. You know, change is really scary, and you know, we're tackling a number of really big issues, from not just housing but police reform, and we're dealing with the health disparities aggravated by COVID, and people are really looking to Berkeley as leaders, as thought leaders, as policy leaders, and as folks who are inheriting, you know, not just a century of racial exclusion, but also a century of transformative change.
Right. That sounds like a great message to let Councilmember Droste and Mayor Arreguín drop off, and we'll cover one more topic afterwards. Thank you guys so much for making the time.
Thank you so much for having us. And I really want to hear from you all. And I want to thank you for your thoughtful engagement and your good faith input. And I look forward to working with people, hopefully, if it passes over the next couple of years. Thank you very much.
All
Thank
right.
you, Jesse. Thank you, Terry. Thank you, Teo.
Bye-bye. Alrighty. Terry, with the slight awkwardness that comes with the Brown Act, could we ask you a little bit about social housing? I know you're bringing something up soon. Could you just give the outlines of that for the assembled?
Sure. So social housing is a kind of housing that we see in Vienna, that we see in Singapore, a kind of mixed income, cross-subsidized, community-controlled, state-owned housing that is available to folks of all income. I was really inspired by the Moms for Housing movement and various other movements that are addressing the failures of the private market to provide housing for all, the shortcomings of commodified housing. And given the moment we are in with RENA and having to do a housing element, and we're seeing a surmounting affordability crisis and homelessness crisis. I figured the timing was right to pursue a variety of innovative housing strategies. So the item we are proposing is a resolution affirming housing as a human right and calling for the feasibility study of a social housing pilot program here in Berkeley.
Fantastic. All righty. Thank you very much. And I think with that, and I would just say, I know we don't want to be nativists, but from myself and Ben as fellow Yellow Jackets, we love having a Yellow Jacket on council. So thank you for representing that segment of our community as well, along with Sophie. I should. We now have two.
Absolutely.
All right. Alrighty. Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us. It's at the 8 o'clock pretty much, and I really appreciate Terry you joining us as well as Lori and Jesse. So thank you for your time, and thank to all the audience members. Goodbye. I see some waves there. That's great.
Thank you. Thanks.
All right.
Great to see you.
I just want to make a plug for the audience. If you enjoyed this forum or any of our previous events, you can sign up on our website at www.bnhca.org to join our mailing list. You can also follow us on Twitter or on Facebook, and we post our events to Berkeley side as well, so you can check them out there. And this event was recorded, so we posted to our YouTube channel later for anyone who wants to see what they missed or share with their friends afterwards as well. Thank you all.
All righty. Good night, everybody. Thank you so much.